Ever wondered what happens to your voice recordings when you use those AI voice apps? The ones that can make you sound like Morgan Freeman or even like your own grandma.
It's a little creepy when you think about it.
It really is. And that's what today's deep dive is all about. We're taking a look at voice data and privacy policies, specifically those from Elevanlabs. They're the company behind some of the most realistic AI voices out there.
They are, and they just updated their privacy policy.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll be looking at, the document from April 30th, 2024.
Hot off the presses, although we do have one other little curveball for this deep dive.
Oh.
Yeah, we've got this weird note about small print and a podcast. Definitely not something you see every day.
Well, that's intriguing. Where should we start?
Let's just dive right into Elevanlabs' privacy policy.
Sounds good to me.
So they lay out what data they collect. A lot of it is pretty standard. Like, you make an account, they need your contact info. You want to generate a voice, they obviously need the text you're using. And if you're cloning a voice, well, they're going to need your voice recordings for that.
Makes sense. That's the foundation of any voice-based platform.
Right. But then they mention creating a voice model from your recordings.
Yes.
So they're not just like storing the recording itself, they're analyzing it on a deeper level.
Exactly.
How detailed are we talking here? I mean, are they capturing every single vocal tick and like tremor in your voice?
Pretty much. Think of it as them creating a super detailed sonic fingerprint of your voice.
Okay, that is both really cool and kind of scary.
They analyze things like those tiny tremors you mentioned, how you emphasize words, even your breathing patterns. All of that goes into making your unique voice model.
No wonder those AI clones are getting so realistic.
I know, it's pretty incredible technology.
It is. But, okay, so that's if I'm actually choosing to upload my voice. But then they mention using publicly available information to train their models to.
Right. That's a key part of how these AI models learn and get better over time.
But what does that even mean? What kind of information?
It's anything that's easily accessible. YouTube videos, podcasts, audiobooks, even just public speeches. If it's out there in the digital world, they could potentially use it.
Okay, see, now that makes me a little uneasy.
I can see why.
Because it's one thing if I'm actively using their features and I'm uploading my voice, but using publicly available stuff for training, what if I don't want my voice replicated by AI?
That's the big question, isn't it? It really highlights this evolving landscape of voice data and privacy. Like, how much control do we actually have over how our voices are used, especially as this AI tech gets more and more advanced?
Right. And you were just saying how precise those voice models are getting. If they can capture all those nuances from public data, that's kind of a big deal.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to be aware of, especially as we see AI voice technology becoming more common in our everyday lives.
For sure. Okay, well, on that slightly unnerving note, let's move on to another part of the policy that I found interesting. There's this whole section specifically about Illinois and something called biometrics. What's that all about?
Oh, Illinois is interesting. They have some of the strictest biometrics privacy laws in the U.S.
What do you?
Yeah, it's called the Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA for short.
We do love a good acronym. But what makes it so different? What is BPA?
It all comes down to recognizing that certain types of data, biometric data, are super sensitive. Things like your fingerprints, iris scans.
And our voices.
Exactly. They're uniquely linked to your identity in a way that other data isn't. You can change your password if it's compromised, but you can't exactly change your voice.
That's a good point. And kind of terrifying at the same time.
Right.
Like, that's straight out of a spy movie.
And that's why Illinois decided to take it seriously. They've got these stricter regulations on how companies can collect and use that kind of data, including voice data.
So if you live in Illinois, you've got extra protection. Nice. Good to know. But does Elevanlabs actually address all of this, especially with this whole Illinois situation?
They do. They actually mention getting consent for voice data, especially from Illinois residents.
Okay, so they're definitely aware of it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, this whole BIPA thing has really shone a light on voice as a sensitive piece of data, and it seems like companies are having to adapt.
Oh, yeah.
Which is good.
It's about time. It's like we're living in some kind of Black Mirror episode. Our voices are like the new passwords, except way less cool tech and definitely no cool cyberpunk aesthetic.
I mean, you're not wrong.
But seriously, though, as voice recognition tech keeps getting more ingrained in our lives, we're already unlocking our phones and yelling at our smart homes with our voices. The security and privacy of that data becomes super important.
Absolutely. You're preaching to the choir here.
It's definitely reassuring to know that they're at least acknowledging these regulations. But, besides Illinois, what about their overall data retention policy? How long do they actually hold on to this voice data?
Well, they explicitly state in their policy that they keep it for 3 years after your last interaction with them.
3 years. Is that like standard practice?
Yeah, it's actually pretty common for a lot of companies to keep data for around that long.
Okay, so that makes me feel a little bit better.
But, and this is a big but, when we're talking about something as sensitive as voice recordings, especially with how scarily accurate these voice models are getting, a shorter retention period might be better, just from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, 3 years of voice data just seems like a treasure trove for potential misuse, even if it's not intentional.
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's something to think about with any service that's collecting your voice. It's not just about what they're doing with it in the present, but how long they're planning to keep it around.
Right. Okay, that's a super important point. So moving on from data retention, which is apparently a bit of a downer, let's talk about the good stuff. What are they doing to protect all this data they're collecting? I mean, they have to have some safeguards in place, right?
Oh, absolutely they do. One thing that really stood out to me in their policy was how they talked about using voice data to fight against misuse, specifically mentioning deepfakes.
Oh, that's interesting. Using the tech to fight the potential dark side of the tech. So how does that work? And how effective is it really?
It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one side, using this voice data to train algorithms to spot deepfakes is actually pretty smart. The more data they have, the easier it is for them to spot those fakes. They can basically teach their AI to recognize a phony when it hears one.
That's kind of amazing. It's like a digital bloodhound sniffing out the imposters. But you said it was a double-edged sword. What's the downside?
The issue is that this all depends on how sophisticated their algorithms actually are. And the technology behind deepfakes is constantly evolving at an incredible pace. It really is a cat and mouse chase. Just because they're taking steps to address it now doesn't mean they'll always be ahead of the game.
Oh, so it's a technological arms race. Comforting. Well, I guess that makes sense. So what can we, as everyday users, do to protect ourselves in this crazy world of AI voice cloning? Besides, like, swearing off technology and moving to a remote island somewhere.
While a digital detox on a remote island does sound kind of amazing right now, you'll be happy to know there are more practical things you can do. It really boils down to understanding your rights as a user.
Speaking of which, Elevanlabs actually does a pretty decent job of outlining your rights in their policy, which is great.
I agree. It's always a good sign when a company is upfront about that.
Totally. So they talk about your right to access the data they have about you, delete it, and this is a big one, request that your data not be used for those training purposes we talked about.
That's huge, especially for people worried about having their voice cloned without their consent. That opt-out option gives you back a little bit of control.
Power to the people. Knowledge is power, as they say. This is all stuff you can actually act on, right? It's not just theoretical legal mumbo-jumbo.
Definitely not. It's crucial to remember that you have rights when it comes to your data, and you absolutely should exercise those rights.
Don't just blindly click accept on those terms of service, people. Read them. It might be boring, but hey, you might be surprised by what you find. Or at the very least, you'll know what you're getting yourself into.
Well said. An informed user is a safer user after all.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered accessing your data, deleting it, and that super important opt-out of having your voice used for training. But, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, how do you actually navigate all the options for opting out? It's not always as straightforward as it seems, right?
Oh, you are absolutely right. It can feel like navigating a maze sometimes.
Right. Okay, good. It's not just me. They let you opt out of commercial emails, which, sure, who needs more spam? But then there are push notifications and targeted advertising. Is all that coming from the same data? If you opt out of one, are you covered for all of them?
You've just hit on a really common point of confusion for a lot of people, and it's a fair point to raise.
Oh, thank goodness. So I'm not just technologically challenged.
Not at all. A lot of privacy policies, and Elevanlabs is no different here. They kind of struggle to find a good balance between making things user-friendly while also giving users granular control over their data.
Right, because I do want to be able to say, hey, use my data for this specific thing, but absolutely not that other thing.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you end up with like 20 checkboxes and submenus, and it's just too much.
Exactly. And that can actually become a barrier to people giving informed consent. Let's be honest, sometimes it's just easier to click accept all than try to figure out a document that feels like it's a million pages long.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better about being confused. Sometimes it really does feel like it's designed to be that way.
I can see why you'd feel that way. This really highlights the need for greater transparency and clearer, more user-friendly language in these policies.
100%. Elevanlabs, if you're listening, maybe someone should send them this episode. Okay, but before we wrap up, we have to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say the small print in the room? Because honestly, this whole thing feels like it's straight out of an episode of the Small Print podcast itself.
It's definitely a weird one. It's like they knew
Yeah.
we'd be doing a deep dive and decided to get meta on us.
Right. Like, we've got these instructions that are clearly not part of the actual Elevanlabs policy. They're just telling us to wrap up by saying, read the small print.
And to give a shout out to the Small Print podcast.
Exactly. Which, by the way, if you're not listening to it, you should be. But it's just so strange. Like, are they trying to tell us something? Is this some secret message buried within a privacy policy?
It really makes you think. I mean, you don't see this level of self-awareness in legal documents every day.
My conspiracy brain is like, this has to be a sign. There's something more going on here.
Or, maybe it's just some really clever marketing by the small print folks.
True, true. But either way, it definitely worked on me because now I really want to know if they do a deep dive on Elevanlabs.
Honestly, me too.
But on a more serious note, this whole deep dive has really got me thinking about the big picture. Elevanlabs, they're just one company, right? AI voice technology is blowing up everywhere these days.
It is. And it's only going to get bigger.
Exactly. And all those other companies, they'll have their own privacy policies, their own rules about your voice data. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So what's the takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about as we go further down this AI rabbit hole?
It boils down to awareness. Our voices, they're like our ultimate passwords these days. And they're becoming more and more valuable. And like anything valuable, there are risks. We have to be informed. We have to understand how our data is being used and what rights we have when it comes to controlling it.
Don't be afraid to ask questions. Demand transparency. And seriously, read the small print, even if it's buried in a wall of text.
Couldn't agree more. We can't just be passive about this. The future of AI is being decided right now, and our voices, both literally and figuratively, are a part of that.
Well said. So to wrap things up, I think we have to end this the only way that makes sense, given everything we've just talked about. Remember, everyone, read the small print. You never know what you might find.
And don't forget to check out the Small Print podcast for even more deep dives into those easily overlooked details of our digital lives.
Until next time.